Okay guys, we're going to look at the B3 homeostasis and response, which is focusing upon nerves, hormones, the eye, and our general response, which aids survival. And we're going to look at the answers, which are obviously based upon facts and things you know and understanding, but also looking at mark schemes to see if we can see any trends and use it for exam technique. There's obviously a lot of repetition in biology and the sciences. The science doesn't change. So each year, they're going to ask you a slightly different version of a question you've probably seen before, which means we can learn a lot from mark schemes. So, question 1, describe how the brain is informed of the image detected by the retina. So, we've got the eye, obviously, and the retina is at the back of the eye. And in order to get to the brain, we have a nerve impulse, which runs from the receptor, which is the retina, via the optic nerve up to the brain. And so we have retina or receptor, optic nerve, which is an electrical impulse, chung, cha, chung, chung, and then to the brain, which translates the image. Interestingly, it says, look, do not credit message on the right hand side. So it's looking for electrical signal or impulse. It's not looking for message. So that's a message, excuse the pun, from the board. Okay. So you can see here the second mark, receptor or neuron of retina and sent along the optic nerve for your 3 marks. Okay. So question 2, a man hurt his head in an accident. Doctors found that he could not remember anything that happened on the day of the accident. Name the part of the brain concerned with memory. Well, that's just a fact. That's the cerebral cortex. Name one method the doctors could use to find out how much the brain was damaged. Well, this is an interesting question because it's only 1 mark, but they need to give you all of the possible syllabus scans that could be performed. Okay, because they're not making you second guess which one they're talking about. So you can see MRI is a good option here, but they're allowing the CT or the CAT scan. They don't allow it if you get the letters the wrong way around, as you'd expect. MRI isn't accepted. And they also accept electrode stimulation, okay, which is where you'd get electrodes and they shock pulse you, okay. So that's quite interesting from a mark scheme perspective, because if you look at those and you don't understand or aren't aware of any of those, then you need to revise those, because that, in your exam, one of those could come up, okay. Outside the MRI, it might be about a CAT scan or a CT scan, okay. So B, the doctors were worried that the man might also have injured his spine. They touched different areas of his skin with a sharp point. They asked him to tell them each time he could feel the sharp point. Explain how the information about the sharp point touching the skin reaches the man's brain. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about receptor and our overall process. If we're thinking about this, and the one thing actually I would say about this is this is 6 marks. So I'm automatically thinking I'm really going to have to pack this with keywords and detail. So if you remember our basic nervous system arrangement, we've got a receptor which picks up a stimulus. Okay, it then transfers that into an electrical signal, which goes to a sensory neuron, and then it will go to a relay neuron, and that will probably go up to the brain, if it's a conscious decision, via the spinal cord. Okay, and then the signal will come back to a motor neuron. This is our whole basis of a nerve, a response, and then that will go to an effector, which is a muscle or gland. Okay, if it was a reflex action, it would go directly from relay to motor neuron and not involve the spinal cord or the central nervous system. Okay, so I'm thinking about the whole nerve setup here. Now, in this question, let's see what it says. Explain how the information about the sharp point touching the skin reaches the man's brain. Okay, so actually, we can see that we are not involving the effector or the motor neuron here. Okay, we are talking about the stimulus, which is going to be a pain, a sharp point creating a pain going to the brain. So I'm now thinking, okay, well, 6 marks, I'm going to have to mention all of this. There's a stimulus, I've got a pain receptor, I've got a sensory neuron, which is transferring to the spinal cord via a relay neuron. It's going to take it to the brain. But I don't know if that's so much detail. So what else can we say about this? Well, do you remember that each of the points of the contact here, so the sensory neuron going to a relay neuron, is going to have a synapse. Okay, and a synapse is the... So with a synapse, we've got a neuron which is joined to another neuron, but there's a gap. Okay, and into this gap is a diffusion of what we call a neurotransmitter, which diffuses across the gap and causes the actual electrical impulse to be carried on from neuron A to neuron B. So this would be the same between a sensory neuron and a relay neuron and a motor neuron. Okay, so that is, if we're talking about explain how the information about the sharp point touching the skin reaches the man's brain, and we're talking about 6 marks, we know that we're going to go into more detail because we're not able to mention the effector and the motor neuron because that's after the brain. Okay, so now with this in mind, I'm thinking about talking about the stimulus, which is the sharp object, on the receptor, which happens to be a pain receptor, which transduces the stimulus into an electrical signal, which is carried by the sensory neuron, which is then synapses to a relay neuron in the spinal cord, which goes to the brain, and the synapse has a neurotransmitter which diffuses across it's called the synaptic cleft, or the gap between the neurons, carrying the signal to the brain. Okay, so if we look on the right hand side, we've got here the mark scheme. We can see sharp point stimulates, so that's the stimulus I was talking about, the receptor, okay, to send a nerve impulse via sensory neuron. Okay, so remember at the top here, in the first question we had nerve impulse, and so can you see the terminology that they're looking for? Electrical impulse, okay, via sensory neuron to the spinal cord. It says do not accept spine and ignore central nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord together. Okay, so the sensory neuron leads to the spinal cord. Okay, it wouldn't be right to say central nervous system because it hasn't got to the brain yet. It's just the spinal cord. Okay, I've mentioned the relay neuron, which takes the signal, crosses synapse, and as I said, a neurotransmitter crosses the synaptic cleft. That's going into more detail than you need, but I'd put it in. Okay, to other relay neurons to the brain. Okay, so you can see there that all the information that I have talked about, I'm putting in. And think about the key words: the stimulus, the pain receptor, the sensory neuron, the synapse, the neurotransmitter, the relay neuron, the spinal cord. They're all the things that are hitting. Look how precise this is. To such an extent, guys, the mark schemes, if you were to literally write that many words in your whole answer, you would get all the marks. Okay? And notice that I have ignored motor neuron and effector. Okay? And just finishing off, it says do not accept motor neuron. Okay? Allow explanation in a flow diagram. Well, I've done this in my head. You could even write a diagram, okay, and then explain it all. Okay? So that's the way that I would be thinking in terms of a question, 6 marks, mapping out the process. And notice there, when I was doing that question, with 6 marks, and it was from the stimulus to the brain, I was thinking, hang on, that's not going to be enough marks for receptor, sensory neuron, relay neuron, brain. I'm going to have to include more. So notice the way that I went after the synapse, because that's information that we know about the nervous system, in order to give me 6 really good points. I didn't fluff out what I know about sensory neurons and receptors in order to try and get the 6. Okay, I went into a little more detail. Of course, I talked about a receptor transferring the stimulus into an electrical signal, which wasn't mentioned, but that's good stuff. And I went into a bit more detail about the neurotransmitter. That's good stuff, because it might well be that you do need that detail in your exam. Okay? So, next part. The doctors found that the man could feel the sharp point when the point touched his arms, but not when the point touched his legs. Suggest what this information could tell the doctors about the damage to the spinal cord. Explain your answer. Okay, so we're talking about a situation where there is an impulse being received from the arms, but not the legs. So this is we're talking about 2 marks here. We're looking for 2 points which talk about some kind of barrier from the legs to the spinal cord, but not from the arms. Okay, so in the mark scheme you can see here, the damage must be between the arms and legs, or below the arms, since the information from the nerves in the arms still reaches the brain, but from the legs it doesn't. Okay, so that's the nerves question with a number of the points that I've mentioned.